Hey guys, tonight we're unraveling how a tangled mess of cotton railroads and tax fights managed to drag an entire country into civil war. You'll be lying in your cozy bed, while thousands of farmers, soldiers, and senators are about to scream, march, and occasionally faint in wool uniforms under a summer sun. The year is somewhere in the early 1800s, and the ground beneath your imaginary bare feet is covered in soft, fluffy cotton, except it's not as innocent as it looks. That cotton, it's about to change the fate of millions. You're about to live through a world where being born in the wrong state can mean your entire life is decided before you say your first word. This journey's going to include enraged senators, secret mailbags full of abolitionist propaganda, and trains that carry more political weight than you'd think possible. And spoiler, you probably won't survive this metaphorically, of course. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Cotton. It sounds soft, white, clean. But in the American South, around the early 1800s, it's more like a trap, one that's growing teeth. After the invention of the cotton gin in 1793 by Eli Whitney, a guy who thought he was solving a mechanical problem, cotton farming explodes. The gin, short for engine, made it stupidly easy to remove seeds from cotton fibers. It used to take a full day to clean 1 pound of cotton by hand. With the gin, 50 pounds in a day per machine. And suddenly, boom, cotton becomes the oil of the 19th century. The Deep South transforms almost overnight into a factory of fields, producing what the world desperately wants: cheap, breathable textiles. Britain can't get enough. France followed. Even New York bankers smile a little wider when the boats come in. Cotton is feeding global industry, and it's feeding America's appetite for profit. But it comes at a cost. A horrifying cost. To grow that much cotton, you need land. You need labor. And in the antebellum South, that labor is enslaved. People are bought, sold, whipped, worked, and broken, all to keep the cotton flowing. Cotton doesn't just reinforce slavery, it supercharges it. In 1800, there were fewer than 1 million enslaved people in the US. By 1860, there were nearly 4 million. And the cotton itself, it's everywhere. On your fake 1840s back, there's probably a shirt made from it. Your pillowcase, your socks. The economy is literally clothed in slavery, even in places that claim to hate it. But it's not just the fields, it's the money. The South becomes a land of sprawling plantations and aristocratic families who think they've hit the jackpot. And they kind of have. Cotton is responsible for more than half of all US exports by mid-century. That's not a cash crop, that's a currency. Historians still argue whether the South was actually economically backward or just differently structured. But what's certain is that the cotton economy made Southern elites very rich and very defensive. They built an entire society on this crop and the people they forced to farm it. When anyone, especially from the North, questioned the morality of slavery, Southerners didn't just take offense, they saw it as a threat to their entire way of life. Here's the quirky part. Eli Whitney was a Northerner, a Yankee from Massachusetts. He probably didn't realize he'd just poured gasoline onto a national dumpster fire. And despite inventing something that literally changed the global economy, he died broke. His patent wasn't properly enforced, and thousands of knockoff gins flooded the South. So yes, the man who supercharged the plantation economy didn't even get rich off it. Capitalism is funny like that. Meanwhile, as the South rolls in cotton wealth, the North is doing its own thing, building factories, attracting immigrants, developing infrastructure. The gap is widening, and cotton is one of the crowbars driving the wedge. And underneath it all, the land is being eaten. Cotton's a greedy plant. It drains soil nutrients fast, forcing plantations to move westward into Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas. Each step west means another fight over whether new land should allow slavery. And every fight, a mini dress rehearsal for civil war. Here's the part that's easy to forget when we're lying on a memory foam mattress 200 years later. Cotton doesn't just sit there, it moves. It moves enslaved people, it moves money, it moves political power, and it moves armies eventually. Imagine you're living in Georgia, 1845. You're 10. Your family owns 50 enslaved people. There's a huge house with columns and a wraparound porch and iced tea on the table, but it's all propped up on a kind of quiet terror. You know somewhere in the back of your mind, though you'd never say it, that your life only works because someone else's doesn't. That's the foundation of what's about to fall apart. Cotton has made the South rich, yes, but it's also made it brittle, dependent, arrogant, and deeply afraid of change. And while you sleep, tucked under metaphorical cotton sheets, that fear is growing. The North is looking faster, smarter, and somehow morally cleaner, even if it's still buying Southern cotton. The South is feeling judged, isolated, and trapped in its own success. That's where we begin. Not with cannons or soldiers, but with soft white fluff and a sharp, spinning machine. The war isn't here yet, but the fuse? It's already lit. The South was basking in cotton riches, but way up north, life was clanging with hammers, clattering with rail cars, and choking on factory smoke. While plantation owners were sipping bourbon on wraparound porches, northern workers were punching time cards and trying not to get their hands caught in a spinning jenny. Two very different Americas were growing, and they were growing in opposite directions. Cities like Boston, Philadelphia, and New York were swelling like yeast bread left too long on a warm windowsill. Factories churned out boots, textiles, and tools, powered by coal and elbow grease. Immigrants flooded in, mostly Irish and German, ready to trade farm life or political chaos back home for a shot at a tenement room and a miserable wage. Welcome to the North. Smoke-filled, overcrowded, bustling with invention, and a little bit smug about it. Meanwhile, the South looked around and said, why change? Cotton was still the golden goose. Why build smokestacks and train yards when the earth itself could spin you gold? They didn't need immigrant labor. They had enslaved people, cheaper, permanent, and brutally efficient. And unlike factories, cotton didn't go on strike. This wasn't just an economic divide, it was cultural. Northern cities hummed with reform movements, Sunday lectures, abolitionist pamphlets, and experimental diets involving boiled cabbage. The South rolled its eyes and poured another drink. Where the North prided itself on progress, the South prized tradition. And when the North sniffed, you can't build a society on slavery, the South hissed back, you already did, you just outsourced it. This tension had teeth. Every new railroad in the North made Southern leaders twitch. Every new mile of telegraph wire felt like a string being pulled tight. And here's where it gets fun. Northern industry wasn't just about making stuff. It was about shaping power. The more the North grew, the more seats it earned in the House of Representatives. And if there's one thing the Southern elite hated more than abolitionists, it was losing votes in Congress. And then there's tariffs. Those lovely taxes on imported goods. Northern factories wanted them high. Protect domestic industry. Make British goods expensive so people buy American. The South, not so much. They exported cotton and imported nearly everything else, especially fine European goods. So tariffs just meant paying more for stuff they didn't even make. Historians still argue whether the tariff issue was a legitimate economic grievance or just a convenient excuse for deeper resentments. But what's clear is that Southern leaders saw the writing on the factory wall. The North was becoming richer, faster, and more politically powerful, and doing it without slaves. Let's zoom in on two households. One in Massachusetts, one in Mississippi. In the North, you've got a middle-class family. Dad's a skilled machinist. Mom keeps the house. Their oldest boy is in school, and their daughter just got a job in a textile mill. They don't have much, but they believe in free labor, the idea that you earn your way, even if it's hard. In the South, you've got a wealthy planter with hundreds of acres, and maybe 60 enslaved people. His kids are privately tutored, his wife hosts lavish dinners, and their wealth is built entirely on inherited land and human bondage. And they believe that's how it should stay. Those two families live in the same country. They vote for the same president, but they have less in common than a hedge fund manager and a food delivery biker today. And both sides are starting to realize it. Here's a quirky one. Many Southern aristocrats travel to Europe. and were treated like minor royalty. Why? Because they arrived in England or France with trunks full of money, letters of introduction, and a charming southern drawl. In contrast, northern businessmen were often seen as pushy and a little too eager. So yes, in some elite circles, the southern slaveholder had more cultural cachet than the New England banker. Weird world. But image doesn't equal power, and while the South was drinking sherry at Oxford, the North was wiring up the future. Telegraph lines stretched across states, canals crisscrossed the landscape, railroads boomed, and Wall Street started looking more like a real empire builder, and less like a gambling den. The South watched nervously. Every time Congress debated something, tariffs, territory, taxes, it felt like the North was rigging the game. Southern senators began talking in darker tones, whispering of betrayal, cultural extinction, and plots against their way of life. And yet the North didn't care all that much. To many Northerners, the South looked like a sulky aristocracy clinging to an immoral past. Industrialists mocked the moonlight and magnolias myth. Journalists ridiculed the idea that picking cotton made you noble. Abolitionists accused the South of being a national embarrassment. And that attitude, it burned like acid. No one likes being told they're the villain in someone else's bedtime story. Here's the kicker. Both regions depended on each other more than they admitted. Northern factories turned southern cotton into shirts. Southern plantations relied on northern ships, banks, and insurance. They were locked together like an unhappy couple who couldn't afford to divorce. But the balance was shifting. Every new northern mile of railroad, every new shipment of Irish immigrants willing to work for pennies, every new factory popping up in the Rust Belt before it rusted. These were nails in the coffin of the old Southern dream. And as power tilted northward, the South grew louder, more defensive, and more willing to draw lines in the dirt. You can hear it in the speeches. You can see it in the editorials. One side talking about innovation and labor rights, the other about honor, tradition, and God-given ways of life. It's not a war yet, but if you close your eyes, you can almost hear the low drumbeats starting. The North and South aren't just two regions anymore. They're two visions of America, and they're starting to glare at each other across the Mason-Dixon line like a bad stare-down in a saloon. Tariffs. Taxes on imported goods. A word that sounds like background noise in a high school history class. Until you realize it's one of the first dominoes to tip the nation towards civil war. Tariffs didn't start out looking dangerous, but like a hairline crack in a dam, they deepened until the water was pouring through. In the early 1800s, America was still figuring out how to make money. The North, factory towns, wage labor, and mass production. The South, endless rows of cotton and enslaved labor. One made things, the other grew things. That's where tariffs come in. See, when European goods, especially from Britain, flooded the US market, they threatened American industry. The North couldn't compete with cheap British steel or textiles. So Congress passed protective tariffs. The goal was simple: make foreign stuff more expensive, so people would buy American. Northern factories cheered. Southern planters, not so much. Why? Because the South wasn't buying looms or machine parts from Massachusetts. They were importing luxury goods from Europe, fine clothes, tools, even furniture. Those new tariffs made everything they needed cost more. Worse, Britain and France weren't thrilled about the extra taxes, so they retaliated by buying less cotton. That meant fewer profits for Southern planters, even though they had nothing to do with Northern factories in the first place. It felt like a rigged game. The South was being punished to protect an industrial economy they didn't benefit from. Imagine going out to eat, not ordering a thing, and still getting charged for everyone else's appetizers. That's what the South saw in the tariffs. And it wasn't just economic, it was personal. The most infamous of these taxes hit in 1828, the so-called Tariff of Abominations. That's not sarcasm, that's the actual nickname. It raised duties so high that southern states practically choked. South Carolina, in particular, lost it. Planters were furious, politicians were livid, and a firebrand named John C. Calhoun, then Vice President of the United States, started laying the groundwork for open rebellion. Historians still argue whether the tariff issue was a real existential crisis or just a useful political tool. But for many in the South, it felt like being muscled out of their own government. They were paying more, earning less, and getting lectured by northern politicians about modernization. Tariffs became a symbol, not just of economic unfairness, but of a deeper fear that the federal government was growing into a tool of northern dominance. Every tax bill felt like an insult. Every factory subsidy felt like theft. It was less about what was taxed, and more about who was in control. And here's where it gets spicy. The South wasn't known for quiet grumbling. South Carolina took the rage and turned it into doctrine. Enter the theory of nullification, the idea that a state could ignore any federal law it didn't like. That's not how the Constitution works, of course, but try telling that to a state legislature full of furious planters. Nullification wasn't just political theory, it was a full-on constitutional crisis in the making. And the man caught in the middle? President Andrew Jackson, a Southerner by birth, a tough-as-iron military hero, and a man who hated anyone questioning federal authority almost as much as he hated the British. When South Carolina declared the tariffs null and void, Jackson didn't send a polite letter. He sent warships. He signed the force bill, allowing him to use military action to enforce federal law. And just like that, you had the US president threatening to invade a US state over taxes. Quirky fact, during this standoff, Jackson actually wrote a private letter saying that if Calhoun and his allies didn't back down, he'd personally hang them from the nearest tree. That's not metaphor, that's Jackson. It didn't come to that. Cooler heads brokered a compromise tariff in 1833. South Carolina backed off, barely, but the wounds stayed open. The nullification crisis didn't just end, it smoldered. It showed that states like South Carolina were willing to go to the brink for what they saw as their rights. And it gave them a blueprint for secession 3 decades later. The tariff crisis also added something new to Southern identity, the idea of victimhood. Suddenly, it wasn't just about protecting slavery or cotton, it was about resisting tyranny, about defending local power from a bloated, overreaching federal government. Sound familiar? And while the North mostly shrugged it off, Southern newspapers began talking about Northern aggression even when nothing was happening. A raised tariff wasn't just annoying, it was seen as one more step in a quiet war. You can almost feel the psychological shift. The South, once confident and dominant, now felt threatened, economically, politically, and culturally. And when people feel cornered, they start looking for exit signs. Here's a lesser-known ripple effect. The tariff fight created unlikely allies. Some Northern Democrats actually sympathized with the South's complaints, not because they loved slavery, but because they hated strong federal control. So for a while, odd political coalitions kept the peace. But it was like patching a volcano with chewing gum. Meanwhile, the cotton fields kept expanding, the population grew, and new territories out west opened like shiny gifts from the land fairy. Every time a new territory asked to join the Union, the same question flared up. Would they allow slavery? And each time that question brought the memory of tariffs and nullification roaring back. Because if the government could tax your imports, maybe it could tell you how to run your plantations. Maybe it could even outlaw slavery entirely. That fear, it stayed simmering just below the surface. By now, tariffs weren't just economic policy. They were flashpoints in a cultural war between an industrializing, fast-paced, reform-happy North and an agricultural, slow-to-change, defensive South. Tariffs had stirred the pot, nullification had lifted the lid, and all around you could hear the clink of spoons circling the edge, nervous, agitated, metallic. The next time the government tried to compromise, it wouldn't be about taxes. It would be about people, power, and who gets to say what America really stands for. And this time, nobody would back down so easily. Now that South Carolina had tasted the sweet, spicy idea of nullification, flirting with open defiance of federal law, it wasn't going back to just nodding politely. After the Tariff of Abominations tantrum, the idea was loose in the air. Maybe states didn't have to listen to Washington. Maybe the Union wasn't an unbreakable promise, but more like a contract. One you could tear up if the other side stopped playing fair. And for South Carolina's elite, fair meant hands off their money, their laws, and especially their human property. Nullification, in theory, was simple. If the federal government passed a law the state didn't like, the state could declare it null and void within its borders. Think of it like a teenager slamming the door and shouting, "You're not the boss of me," except with cannons. This was the brainchild of John C. Calhoun. Yes, that same vice president from earlier. He had once believed in the strength of the Union, but the tariff crisis cracked something. He came to see the South not as a section of the country, but as a distinct civilization, one that needed to defend itself from creeping tyranny, disguised as taxation, and eventually, abolition. Here's the twist. Calhoun wasn't a bomb thrower. He wore tailored coats, quoted Cicero, and moved like a ghost through Senate chambers. But under the powdered hair was a mind that believed America needed concurrent majorities. That is, every region should be able to veto national decisions that might harm it. That sounds kind of cooperative, until you realize it gave a minority the power to shut down the majority. Historians still argue whether Calhoun was trying to preserve liberty, or just slavery in a powdered wig. Either way, his ideas planted deep roots. After Jackson's "I will hang you" response during the 1832 crisis, South Carolina did something quietly theatrical. They repealed their nullification of the tariff, and then turned right around and nullified the Force Bill, the law that gave Jackson permission to invade. That's right, they nullified the thing that said they couldn't nullify things. Political theater at its pettiest. And so, a pattern was born. Southern states wouldn't just disagree with the North. They would claim the right to resist, secede, and maybe even fight. To be fair, the rest of the South wasn't quite ready to follow South Carolina's example. Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi were cautious. They liked Calhoun's fire, but not enough to burn down the house. Still, the idea had been aired out like a rug in the sunshine, and it smelled like rebellion. And then, as if summoned by fate, the slavery debate started creeping back into center stage. See, nullification wasn't just about taxes. That was the appetizer. The real question was, could a federal government tell a state what it could do with its economy, its laws, and its enslaved population? In the 1830s, abolitionist movements in the North began gaining traction, not just among radicals, but in polite drawing rooms, student debates, and even some churches. Suddenly, slavery wasn't just a Southern issue, it was a national one. And the South, it panicked. Imagine being a Southern plantation owner hearing that your right to own people was being debated by a Unitarian book club in Boston. It wasn't just offensive, it was terrifying. If the federal government could slap a tariff on you and survive nullification, maybe next time it wouldn't back down. Here's a quirky side note. During this time, the US Postal Service became a battleground. Abolitionist groups started mailing anti-slavery pamphlets to the South. So many, in fact, that entire sacks of mail would arrive full of leaflets about the moral rot of slavery. Southern postmasters, under pressure from angry mobs and local politicians, started quietly losing the mail. Sometimes they burned it, sometimes they just didn't deliver it. No big deal, just the federal mail system deciding that the First Amendment had a zip code. Andrew Jackson himself, despite being a Southerner, backed the postal burnings. He claimed it was to prevent outrage and violence. In other words, don't poke the hornet's nest. The South, increasingly, saw itself under siege. Northern newspapers mocked their peculiar institution. Preachers in New England called slavery a sin. Even some Northern politicians began to sound morally uncomfortable. The walls were closing in, and many in the South began to speak openly of the need for self-preservation. But again, self-preservation wasn't just economic, it was philosophical. Southern leaders insisted that they were defending liberty, their liberty to structure society as they saw fit. That's how they justified a system that denied liberty to millions. It was liberty for the few. And that twisted logic led to something even darker, a rebranding of slavery itself. No longer just a necessary evil, some Southern intellectuals started calling it a positive good. They claimed that enslaved people were better off under their masters than free in the North. They published essays, gave speeches, and crafted an entire mythology of the benevolent slaveholder. Calhoun, always the ideological craftsman, argued that the South's economy and society were stable, harmonious, and divinely sanctioned, so long as no one meddled. He blamed all discord on outside agitators. Sound familiar? But not everyone in the South was buying it. Poor white farmers, especially those without enslaved labor, had mixed feelings. Some resented the power of plantation elites. Others feared competing with freed black workers. It was messy, and not every Southerner had the same stake in the system. Still, elites held the power, and they were determined to keep it. As Northern abolitionists grew bolder, and Southern nullifiers grew more defiant, the middle ground began to crack. Senators who used to compromise now started issuing ultimatums. Editors who once begged for unity began speaking of irreconcilable differences. It was less of a debate now, and more of a countdown. From the outside, it might have still looked like democracy at work. Inside, it was a slow-motion breakup. Every law passed, every newspaper headline, every fiery pamphlet pushed the two sides closer to a point of no return. South Carolina may have blinked first, but they wouldn't blink last. They'd be back. With friends. The Constitution, so carefully written, so delicately balanced, was starting to feel like a shared lease between bitter roommates. Everyone still had their keys, but they weren't speaking anymore. And downstairs? The kettle was starting to boil. Slavery wasn't just a Southern issue. It was a national shadow, stretching long and cold across every debate, every compromise, every mile of new territory. As the country pushed westward, adding states like they were trophies on a mantle, each new addition became a terrifying question mark. Would it be free, or would it carry chains? In the South, slavery wasn't just part of the economy, it was the economy. Cotton, sugar, rice, tobacco, none of it worked without enslaved labor. And the people at the top of the Southern food chain, wealthy planters with thousands of acres, had built not just farms but dynasties, generational wealth, political power, entire families born and raised with the belief that slavery wasn't just allowed, it was ordained, natural, essential. But here's the catch: the entire system depended on expansion. Cotton depleted the soil fast, so planters were always hungry for fresh land. And that meant pushing west into territories still raw, still wild, and still up for grabs. The moment a new territory was proposed, the screaming started. Would it be a free state? A slave state? Could it be split? What if it started free and changed later? Historians still argue whether the South truly needed expansion to survive, or just believed it did. But perception was reality. The second the expansion door creaked shut, the South started looking for an act. Now, zoom out to Congress. Every time a new state joined, it shifted the balance of power between free and slave states. More free states? That meant more anti-slavery votes. More slave states? That meant safety for now. It turned the Senate into a high-stakes chessboard, and every pawn was a potential battlefield. Take the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Missouri wanted in slaveholding, and proud of it. The North wasn't thrilled, so Congress made a deal. Missouri could join as a slave state, but Maine would be carved out and enter as free. And they drew a literal line across the map. Slavery would be banned in any new territories north of 36° latitude. It was a bandage, a fragile, cracking bandage over a gaping wound, and as the years passed, new states and new dreams kept poking at it. The 1840s brought even more chaos. Texas entered the Union massive, proudly slaveholding, and shaped like it wanted to punch someone. Then came the Mexican-American War, and suddenly the US had way more land. California, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, like a land sale with no refund policy. And right behind that victory came the big awkward question: what now? Slavery or no slavery? Cue the Compromise of 1850. California would be free. The rest of the territories, they'd figure it out for themselves. Popular sovereignty, they called it. Let the people vote, which sounds democratic until people start moving in just to sway the vote. Spoiler, they do. This was also when the Fugitive Slave Act got a mean upgrade. Now, if an enslaved person escaped to the north, local officials had to return them. No questions, no jury. Even private citizens could be fined for helping. It made the North into unwilling enforcers of slavery, and folks were not happy. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some northern towns started using church bells to signal the arrival of slave catchers. Locals would then swarm the courthouse or hide fugitives in homes, barns, and yes, actual hidden basements. The Underground Railroad, not an actual railroad, but it might as well have been, the way it moved people secretly and defiantly northward. For Southern elites, all this debate wasn't academic. They saw it as life or death. If slavery couldn't expand, it would eventually shrink. And if it shrank, their power, their wealth, their very social order would collapse. Even non-slaveholders bought into this fear. Why? Because slavery created a hierarchy. Poor white farmers, even if they had little, were still above someone. That illusion of superiority. It glued the South together. Meanwhile, Northern views were shifting. Not everyone in the North was an abolitionist. Far from it. But more and more people were getting uncomfortable with being complicit. Reading about the Fugitive Slave Act in the newspaper over breakfast was different from confronting it in your own backyard. The moral line was getting harder to ignore. And politicians, they kept trying to balance everything. Add a free state, then a slave state. Draw a new line, redraw it, pretend it's fine. But each compromise looked less like unity and more like denial. The debates in Congress were getting vicious. Senators screamed at each other. Fists flew. One day, not far off, a congressman would literally beat a senator nearly to death with a cane on the Senate floor. But we're not quite there yet. Almost. And the worst part, the country still believed it could hold together, that it could keep papering over the cracks with deals and gestures, that somehow both systems, free labor and enslaved labor, could coexist under the same flag. But coexistence doesn't mean peace. It means tension. Constant, grinding, brittle tension. And the more territory America claimed, the more it had to choose. Freedom or chains. By the 1850s, the choice was becoming impossible to dodge. The West wasn't just open land, it was a battlefield of ideas. What kind of country would America become? One that moved forward, or one that dragged the past with it like a corpse on a gold chain? And in the South, that question sounded less like philosophy and more like war drums. The whole thing was a balancing act on a rope made of fire. Congress kept tossing out compromises like life preservers, but underneath them was a swirling ocean of resentment, fear, and unspoken threats. The North and South had been playing tug-of-war with states and laws for decades. But now, the rope was fraying. You remember that Missouri Compromise line, that neat little horizontal boundary meant to divide the country between slave and free? Yeah, that's about to go up in smoke. As new territories kept applying for statehood, lawmakers scrambled for ways to keep the balance from toppling. Enter the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, a bill that basically bulldozed the Missouri Compromise. Let settlers decide for themselves whether slavery would be allowed. Popular sovereignty, they called it again. Sounds polite, sounds democratic. What it actually meant: send in the mobs. Here's how it went. Settlers, activists, and hired guns started pouring into Kansas with one goal: to rig the vote. Abolitionist farmers moved in from Ohio and Massachusetts, armed with plows and pamphlets, but right behind them came pro-slavery folks from Missouri, nicknamed Border Ruffians, who arrived with whiskey, revolvers, and a distinct lack of chill. What followed wasn't an election, it was a brawl in slow motion. Ballot boxes were stuffed, towns were burned, people were shot in their beds, churches were looted. Newspapers in the North started calling it Bleeding Kansas, and the name stuck. This wasn't just local chaos, it was national theater. Everyone was watching, and what they saw was terrifying. That compromise now meant civilians bringing rifles to town halls. That deciding the future of a state could come down to who had the bigger posse. Historians still argue whether popular sovereignty was doomed from the start, or just poorly executed. But one thing's clear: it opened the door to violence disguised as democracy. One of the most infamous episodes came in 1856. A group of pro-slavery men attacked the town of Lawrence, Kansas, an abolitionist stronghold. They burned buildings, destroyed a printing press, and looted homes. No one died that day, but the message was loud. This wasn't a debate anymore. 3 days later, an abolitionist named John Brown, yes, that John Brown, decided he'd had enough. He and his sons snuck into a pro-slavery settlement at night, dragged 5 men from their homes, and hacked them to death with broadswords. It was called the Potawatomi Massacre, and it turned Brown from a fringe radical into a bloody symbol. In Washington, politicians tried to act surprised, but they'd seen it coming. The tone in Congress had already turned venomous. That same year, Senator Charles Sumner delivered a scathing speech condemning the Kansas violence and mocking pro-slavery senators. One of them, Preston Brooks of South Carolina, took it personally. 2 days later, Brooks walked into the Senate chamber and beat Sumner unconscious with a gold-headed cane. Let that sink in. A US senator was nearly murdered on the floor of the Capitol over a speech, and instead of being shunned, Brooks was celebrated in the South. People sent him new canes in the mail. This wasn't just political drama, it was proof. Proof that words had stopped working, that the cracks in the country were now splitting open in public view. The North recoiled, the South dug in deeper, and Kansas kept bleeding. Guerrilla raids turned the prairie into a chessboard of revenge killings. Towns were divided, homes torched, families torn apart. In some areas, people couldn't tell who was in charge anymore. Authority had fractured, and through it all, national newspapers kept sending updates like war correspondence, quirky detail. In some towns, people started holding mock trials for their enemies, complete with fake judges and impromptu hangings. This wasn't just lawless, it was law wearing a funhouse mask. Kansas was supposed to be a test case for popular sovereignty. What it became was a mirror held up to the nation. Here's what happens when you try to mix moral absolutism with political compromise. When you ask people to vote on whether others should be property. And here's the kicker, Kansas didn't become a slave state. Despite all the violence, it eventually joined the Union as free. But by then, the damage was done. The idea that slavery could be contained, that the Union could hold together with duct tape and handshake deals, was beginning to die. The North saw Kansas as a warning. The South saw it as a betrayal, and both sides saw blood. The great national experiment of compromise, of mutual respect, of pretending that everyone could just get along, was starting to unravel. Piece by piece, shot by shot, vote by crooked vote. It wasn't war. Not yet, but it smelled like smoke. If Kansas was bleeding, the newspapers were the arteries. You didn't have to be on the prairie to feel the shock. Just open a paper in New York, Boston, Richmond, or Charleston. The violence in Kansas wasn't some distant dust-up in flyover territory. It was printed in screaming headlines, complete with woodcut illustrations of burning cabins and bloodied corpses. For many Americans, this was their first real look at what popular sovereignty actually meant, and it was horrifying. News moved slower back then, but it still hit hard. Each new report from Kansas was another log on the fire. Northern abolitionist presses cried outrage. The South is invading the West. Southern newspapers shot back. The North is sending radicals to poison our future. Every side spun the story like cotton candy, twisting it into their own version of doom. And while the country's mood grew darker, something else was happening. People were choosing sides, not just politicians or plantation owners or factory bosses, but regular folks, farmers, teachers, merchants, even people who'd spent years trying not to think about slavery, suddenly found themselves whispering in church pews or arguing at dinner tables. Because you couldn't not talk about it anymore. The fight was literally in the headlines. Here's the quirky bit. New printing technology, like the steam-powered rotary press, meant newspapers were cheaper and more widespread than ever before. Suddenly, even small towns had access to major papers. Literacy rates were rising. People read the news out loud in taverns, in barbershops, on porches, and when they did, they got angry, or scared, or self-righteous, or all three. Reading Kansas became a kind of national theater, but without a script. Every time someone was dragged from their house and shot in the night, it became a morality play. Pick your villain, pick your hero, and shout it to the rooftops. Northerners clutched their paper and saw tyranny. Southerners clutched theirs and saw rebellion. And this wasn't just about slavery anymore. It was about identity, about belonging, about who had the right to shape the future of the country. In the North, abolitionist movements gained new steam. Churches organized meetings. Speakers hit the road, drawing packed crowds in freezing lecture halls. People cried when they heard first-hand accounts from former slaves. They passed around Uncle Tom's Cabin like it was the gospel, because for some, it was. Down south, things got more paranoid. Abolitionist literature was now contraband. Suspicion became a civic duty. In some towns, locals formed vigilance committees to watch for outside agitators. Basically proto-spy rings with more pitchforks and fewer credentials. Even the mail was suspect. Was that pamphlet from Boston? Burn it. Historians still debate how much of this was genuine fear versus political theater. But in places like South Carolina and Georgia, the fear felt real. What if those same radical abolitionists came for you next? What if they sent people to stir up rebellion among the enslaved population? That fear ran deep, especially because the memory of past uprisings, like Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831, still haunted the South. In that case, an enslaved preacher led a revolt that killed dozens of white families. The backlash was swift, brutal, and long-lasting. But the fear never truly faded. In the Southern imagination, every Northern pamphlet might as well be a matchbook. Back in Kansas, the violence kept flaring. Guerrilla warfare, vigilante justice. It became a place where law didn't mean much unless you held the gun. In some towns, people moved multiple times in a single year just to avoid being on the wrong side of a line that changed weekly. And yet, through all this chaos, no one seemed ready to call it what it was: a dress rehearsal for civil war. Congress, as usual, tried to manage the disaster from a safe distance. There were investigations, hearings, proposals, but you can't legislate peace when the country has already armed itself. And when you've got thousands of newspapers feeding that fire, good luck. Every headline was gasoline. One of the most popular political cartoons of the time showed America as a figure literally being torn in half. One side yanking the leg, the other yanking the arm. It was meant to be funny. It wasn't. Even the language of politics was changing. Words like traitor, tyrant, and usurper started popping up in floor speeches. Senators accused each other of dishonor, of deceit, of endangering the nation. The old rules of decorum, out the window, in their place. Barely restrained shouting matches. There was a growing sense that nothing was off the table anymore. If bloodshed could happen in Kansas, why not in other states? If Congress couldn't keep the peace there, how could it be trusted anywhere else? Even families were splitting over the issue. Brothers stopped writing to each other. Friends refused invitations. Marriages grew icy. You didn't just have an opinion on slavery and statehood anymore. You were expected to live it. And Kansas was just the first crack. A visible fracture in the foundation. What people didn't realize yet was that the tremors were just starting. The real quake was coming. You could smell it in the editorials, hear it in the sermons, see it in the votes. The age of compromise was on life support. And most people were already looking for someone to blame when it flatlined. You've probably heard railroads described as the veins of a growing nation. And in the 1850s, those veins were pumping iron. Literally, steel tracks stitched together the North in a giant humming web of motion. People, goods, and ideas zipped from city to city like never before. The sound of a train whistle wasn't just modern, it was powerful. It said, "This place is going somewhere." But in the South, the trains came slower, shorter, less connected, a web with broken strands. See, while the North was busy building an industrial juggernaut, the South had bet everything on cotton. And cotton didn't need railroads to survive. It needed rivers, docks, and enslaved labor. Railroads were a bonus, not a backbone. The numbers tell the story. By 1860, the North had more than 20,000 miles of track. The South, less than half that. Even worse, Southern railroads didn't link up well. You might have to unload an entire train and reload it onto a new one, because the tracks weren't standardized. Imagine Amazon deliveries requiring 10 horse-drawn transfers per state. This difference wasn't just annoying, It was dangerous. In the event of war, which, spoiler alert, is coming, the North would be able to move troops, weapons, and supplies with frightening speed. The South would be trying to coordinate its armies with maps, telegraphs, and hope. But in the 1850s, people weren't thinking quite that far ahead. At least, not most of them. What they were noticing was the growing economic and cultural divide the railroads made obvious. Let's say you're a young man from Pennsylvania. In 1854, you board a train in Philadelphia. 2 days later, you're in Chicago. Along the way, you see factories, growing cities, wheat fields, newspaper stands, and brand new telegraph poles. It's loud, messy, and ambitious. Now imagine you're a merchant in Mississippi. Your world moves at the speed of riverboats. You sell cotton to New Orleans, buy furniture from Europe, and maybe read a 2-week-old newspaper if the mail's on time. Your town has one railroad line that ends 20 miles out of town. There's a general store, a church, and a lot of dust. These aren't just different landscapes, they're different planets. And with that difference came resentment. The North's industrial boom made Southerners feel looked down on. Northern writers mocked lazy planters. Northern politicians bragged about progress and railroad maps. They told the whole story, those elegant lines crisscrossing the North like spiderwebs, while the South looked like it had barely learned how to hold a pen. Historians still debate whether the railroad gap sealed the South's fate in the coming war, but there's no question it made the cultural split more visible. People started to realize this wasn't just a disagreement between neighbors, it was a rivalry between systems. Here's a quirky twist. Southern leaders knew they were falling behind in infrastructure. There were speeches, editorials, even conventions pushing for more investment in railroads and factories. But nothing changed. Why? Because the planter elite didn't want to diversify. Railroads meant new towns, new workers, new politics. That spelled trouble. Better to stay rich on cotton and keep things predictable, even if that meant being vulnerable later. There's something else the railroads did in the North. They spread ideas, fast. You could ship newspapers, books, sermons, and speeches across entire states in a day or two. Abolitionist writers like Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison had their words carried on those trains into cities, villages, even border towns near the South. In contrast, Southern rail lines rarely moved information like that. They were for cotton, for goods, not pamphlets, not ideas that might make people start questioning things. And here's the kicker. While the South prided itself on being an aristocracy of manners and noble traditions, the North was accidentally building a war machine. Not with that intention, of course, more like trying to win at capitalism, but the outcome was the same. Factories could switch from making plows to rifles in a week. Rail lines could carry soldiers just as easily as wheat. The very things that made the North loud, dirty, and chaotic also made it deadly efficient. And as the South watched, it didn't adapt, it doubled down. There were southern towns where rail lines just stopped. No connection to the next major city. No integration with ports. That was fine if your world revolved around cotton and local politics. But it was a logistical nightmare if your state suddenly needed to defend itself on 3 fronts. It's not that the South lacked vision entirely. There were forward-thinking voices, but they were drowned out by the old guard. The plantation class that saw any kind of change as a threat to their control. Industrialization. That meant laborers demanding wages. Railroads. That meant outsiders coming in with new ideas. Better to just build another gin house and trust in tradition. And so the South watched as the North grew stronger, not just richer, but faster, smarter, more interconnected. And all the while, the North's contempt for the old ways grew louder. It wasn't just about slavery, it was about motion. One half of the country was surging forward, the other was standing still, convinced the future would circle back to meet them. Spoiler, it won't. Kansas was still smoldering, charred farms, scattered bodies, voters too afraid to show up to polls, and the rest of the country couldn't stop staring. It was like watching a house fire on your street. Horrifying, but you keep looking, and through that smoke, something strange happened. For the first time, average Northerners, people who'd never spoken a word about abolition, started picking sides. The newspapers had done their job. They didn't just report what was happening, they framed it like an epic morality play. Northern papers printed bleeding headlines and woodcut sketches of homes in ruins, women running with babies in their arms, and bearded ruffians waving torches. The abolitionist press turned the Kansas conflict into the opening act of an American tragedy, starring villainous slave owners and heroic settlers. But the Southern papers were just as loud, blaming black Republicans, their phrase not ours, for stirring up chaos, sending fanatics west, and trying to erase their way of life. The North saw liberty, the South saw sabotage. The country wasn't just reading about Kansas, it was feeling it. And every time someone cracked open a newspaper over breakfast, they had to ask themselves, whose side am I on? In the North, this sparked a wave of new activism. Abolitionist societies, once dismissed as fringe groups with pamphlets and too many candles, started gaining real traction. Ministers thundered from pulpits, poets put their outrage into verse, teachers worked the topic into lessons, even children read stories about brave little abolitionists, helping people escape. Quirky fact: one popular children's book in the 1850s was the child's anti-slavery book, complete with tales of heroic kids defying evil slave catchers. Nothing says bedtime like morally fraught tales of civil disobedience. Meanwhile, the South felt surrounded. With every anti-slavery meeting in Boston, every protest in Philadelphia, every donation to Kansas Free Staters, the sense of siege deepened. They didn't see it as activism, they saw it as aggression, Northern cultural imperialism cloaked in piety. Historians still argue whether the North's growing sympathy for abolition was widespread or just loud. But what's clear is this: by the late 1850s, silence was no longer an option. If you didn't have an opinion about slavery, someone would ask you, and if you gave the wrong one, you'd lose friends, or worse. And it wasn't just about morality anymore, it was about national identity. The idea that the US could be half slave and half free was starting to feel like trying to ride two horses at once, with your eyes closed, over a cliff. Northern society began to fracture in new ways. Some people were anti-slavery but didn't support equality. Others wanted gradual emancipation. A growing group wanted slavery abolished yesterday, and all of them had to navigate the growing political storm. Newspapers helped crystallize these views. Even the act of reading a particular paper became a political statement. You pick up the Liberator, you're an abolitionist. You quote the Charleston Mercury, you're a defender of the South. This is when the term sectionalism really started to matter, not just as a policy issue, but as a feeling. People weren't just Americans anymore, they were Northerners, Southerners, Midwesterners. Their regional identity meant more than the national one. And here's where things got weird. Despite the blood and the headlines, people still thought the Union could be saved. That some brilliant orator, or maybe just a few more compromises, would bring everything back from the edge. There was this stubborn optimism that if people just sat down and talked it out, they could stitch the country back together. But underneath that hope, there was a kind of trembling, like the ground before an earthquake. Everyone could feel something shifting. The polite language of debate was fraying. Senators no longer shook hands after speeches. Newspapers no longer softened their tone. And regular people, they began stockpiling opinions like canned goods. Even churches split. Northern and Southern Baptists could no longer pretend they agreed on the moral question. Methodist congregations fractured. Presbyterians squabbled. When your theology can't survive a tariff debate, something's broken. And then there was art, paintings, poems, songs. They got sharper, less subtle, more aggressive. The arts weren't just entertainment anymore, they were battlegrounds. One fringe example: a Massachusetts choir wrote and performed a hymn called No Union with Slaveholders. Not exactly subtle. Back in Kansas, the violence simmered, but never fully stopped. The territory became a symbol of failure, of democracy, of compromise, of the American promise itself. People pointed at Kansas and said, "This is what happens when you try to avoid the real fight." And that fight was no longer just theoretical. In parlors and meeting halls across the country, people started saying what had once been unthinkable out loud. If it comes to war, I know which side I'm on. The North had found its voice. and it was loud, relentless, and printed on cheap paper. The abolitionist movement, once a handful of firebrand preachers and pacifist idealists, had evolved into a full-blown cultural force. Pamphlets, newspapers, novels, public speeches, these weren't just tools anymore, they were weapons. And they were being lobbed across the Mason-Dixon line like cannonballs made of ink. Abolitionists had been around since the late 18th century, but by the 1850s they'd gone from background noise to headline material. Figures like William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, and Harriet Beecher Stowe weren't just names, they were movements unto themselves. Let's start with Garrison. He founded The Liberator, an anti-slavery newspaper that didn't pull punches. His opening editorial in 1831 famously declared, "I will be as harsh as truth, and as uncompromising as justice." So, not exactly bedtime reading. He called for the immediate end of slavery. No gradualism, no compromise. Just stop. Now, Douglass, formerly enslaved and an astonishing orator, was more than just a symbol. He was living proof that enslaved people were human, brilliant, and capable of burning through hypocrisy, like a lighthouse beam, through fog. He didn't just talk about freedom, he embodied it. When he spoke in northern towns, people wept, or shouted, or stared, stunned, as their entire worldview rearranged itself. Then came Uncle Tom's Cabin, in 1852. Written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, it was a novel so emotionally nuclear that it practically exploded on impact. A work of fiction, yes, but packed with brutal realities about life under slavery. The characters, Uncle Tom, Eliza, Simon Legree, etched themselves into the American mind. Over 300,000 copies sold in the first year. That's Taylor Swift numbers. 1850s edition. Quirky fact, when Abraham Lincoln met Stowe years later, he reportedly said, "So you're the little lady who wrote the book that started this great war." Whether he actually said that or not, historians still argue. But it tells you how much cultural weight that one novel carried. And it wasn't just books. Abolitionist posters went up in cities. Political cartoons depicted slave owners as monsters, slave catchers as goons, and the federal government as morally compromised. Traveling speakers packed halls from New York to Chicago. Children memorized poems about the Underground Railroad, and the message was consistent. Slavery wasn't just a Southern problem, it was your problem. If you lived in the North and did nothing, you were complicit. The South hated every word of it. To them, this wasn't freedom of speech. This was an assault, an organized, sanctimonious smear campaign aimed at dismantling their way of life. And it was working. It made the South feel hunted, insulted, and misunderstood. To be clear, not everyone in the North was on the abolitionist train. Plenty of people opposed slavery in theory, but didn't want freed black Americans living next door. Others feared economic disruption. But what changed in the 1850s was visibility. You couldn't ignore the issue anymore. The pamphlets were in your church. The lectures were in your schoolhouse. The newspaper stories were on your breakfast table. And for the South, the reaction wasn't just defensive, it was furious. Southern states began clamping down. It became illegal in many places to even possess abolitionist literature. Local authorities searched the mail. Bookstores purged their shelves. Teachers were warned not to bring Northern opinions into the classroom. Preachers were told to stick to the Gospels and skip the whole "let my people go" part. Some Southern cities posted guards at train depots to check arriving passengers for anti-slavery materials. It was the 1850s version of banning TikTok, except with more pitchforks and less irony. And here's the creepy part. It worked, at least temporarily. In many Southern towns, public opinion became a monoculture. Dissent went underground or disappeared. Saying the wrong thing in public could get you driven out of town, or worse. Abolitionism had become the great unmasker. It exposed deep fractures not just between North and South, but within each region. In the North, it forced people to confront their own hypocrisy. In the South, it forced even moderates to take a side. Are you with us, or are you a traitor? Historians still debate whether abolitionists accelerated the coming of the Civil War, or merely revealed its inevitability. But no one denies their impact. They made slavery real for millions who had previously chosen to ignore it. And the more the South clamped down, the more the North pushed forward. The two sides weren't just disagreeing, they were escalating. Argument by argument, speech by speech, image by image. Media war, and in this war, the loudest voices were starting to drown out the careful ones. Moderate politicians tried to steer the middle path, but their words were getting swallowed in the noise. The country had started shouting, and it didn't seem like it could stop. You could feel it in the air, thick as coal smoke, the sense that the nation was marching toward a cliff, heads high, flags waving, books in hand, and no one was willing to blink. The louder the North got, the tighter the South clenched its fists. Every pamphlet tossed over the Mason-Dixon line, every fiery abolitionist speech, every page of Uncle Tom's Cabin dropped like acid on Southern pride. What began as anxiety curdled into something heavier, full-blown paranoia. The South didn't just feel insulted anymore, it felt hunted. To understand the Southern mindset by the late 1850s, picture a castle with its gates slammed shut and archers peeking over the walls. Outside are mobs waving torches at least, that's how it felt. Inside, the ruling class whispers about betrayal, revolt, and how they might be next. The fear wasn't completely imagined. Slave rebellions had happened before. Gabriel's rebellion in 1800, Nat Turner's revolt in 1831. That one was especially traumatic. Turner and his followers killed around 60 white people in Virginia, and in the aftermath, terrified planters cracked down with horrific vengeance. Dozens of enslaved people were executed, laws tightened, the whispers grew louder, and in the 1850s, with the abolitionist movement growing, those fears bloomed into obsession. Every suspicious fire, every runaway slave, every sermon that sounded a little too northern, sparked a fresh wave of panic. You didn't have to be an enslaver to feel it. White Southerners, across the class spectrum, were being told, day and night, that their world was under siege, that Northerners weren't just angry, they were planning something, that enslaved people might rise up at any moment. Historians still argue whether this fear was sincerely believed by most Southerners or cynically stoked by politicians. The answer is probably both. Fear makes control easier, and nothing consolidates power like convincing a population they're one step from destruction. The South began to militarize its culture. Militias drilled in town squares. Newspapers encouraged readers to defend Southern honor. Governors talked about fortifying armories. The word secession started to creep into casual conversation, not as a threat, but as a solution. Here's the quirky bit. Southern gentlemen, planters, lawyers, state politicians began building personal arsenals. It became fashionable to own a fine dueling pistol and a stack of rifles, just in case. What kind of weekend do you plan for when your backup hobby is civil defense? Schools, churches, and local governments all fell in line. In many places, teaching enslaved people to read became not just frowned upon, but criminal. The logic was simple and terrifying. Literacy leads to thought, thought leads to rebellion, and rebellion leads to bloodshed. Newspapers printed editorials warning of subversive material, infecting the youth. Booksellers refused to carry radical texts. Some towns went so far as to ban northern publications altogether, like banning music from a band you claim not to fear. Even mail became suspect. The Federal Postal Service was pressured to screen letters and packages coming into southern states. Some postmasters took matters into their own hands, torching bundles of abolitionist materials before they ever reached a doorstep. It wasn't law, but no one stopped them. You know things are spiraling when mail becomes contraband. And while this was happening, politicians in the South grew increasingly belligerent. Men like Robert Toombs of Georgia and James Henry Hammond of South Carolina gave Senate speeches that barely veiled their contempt for the North. They didn't just defend slavery, they glorified it. Hammond famously declared, "You dare not make war on cotton. No power on earth dares make war upon it. Cotton is king." Cotton wasn't just an economic engine anymore. It had become a cultural deity, and if anyone tried to threaten it, war was on the table. At the same time, Northern voices grew more direct. Abolitionists stopped couching their demands in polite terms. Newspapers called the South a barbaric relic. Activists accused Southern leaders of being warlords in waistcoats. This wasn't a disagreement, it was a moral collision. Both sides believed they were under attack. Both sides saw the other as a threat to civilization. And both were arming themselves, literally and ideologically, for the next phase. Even national politics had become a minefield. The Democratic Party, once the bridge between sections, was splintering. The Whigs, already dead, new parties were rising from the ashes. Free soilers, know-nothings, and most importantly, the Republicans. Their platform: stop the expansion of slavery, not abolish it yet, but box it in, cut off its oxygen. To the South, that was the same as abolition, because they knew, without new land, without growth, their entire system would wither. No expansion meant slow death, so every Republican rally, every newspaper headline about freedom, every vote for a Northern candidate felt like a gun pointed at the South's throat. And when you believe someone's aiming at you, it's only a matter of time before you pull the trigger first. By the end of the 1850s, Southern paranoia wasn't just private, it was policy. The South began preparing for war before the first shot was fired. Quietly, carefully, convincingly. In homes and taverns, people talked about secession, not like a crazy idea, but like an inevitable one. Maybe not this year, maybe not next, but soon. The South wasn't waiting to be pushed anymore. It was inching toward the edge all on its own. John Brown didn't whisper, he didn't nudge, he didn't compromise or draft polite letters. He was a thunderclap in a dry forest, loud, unexpected, and setting everything on fire. If the national debate over slavery had been building like a pressure cooker, John Brown didn't release the steam, he threw the whole thing off a cliff. By the time he marched on Harper's Ferry in October 1859, Brown was already infamous. The Potawatomi massacre in Kansas had made him both a villain and a folk hero. Depending on your point of view, he was either a righteous avenger sent by God or a terrorist wielding the Bible like a bayonet. But Harper's Ferry? That was different. That was bold. That was national. The plan was almost absurdly ambitious. Brown would take the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Then he'd arm enslaved people from the surrounding plantations. A massive uprising would ripple outward like a holy shockwave. Plantations would fall, chains would snap, slavery would die, not from politics, but from rebellion. Quirky fact: Brown brought 21 men with him. That's right, 21. 5 black, 16 white, a tiny army with a massive dream. They packed rifles, pikes, and an unshakable belief that the time for words was over. At first it kind of worked. They stormed the arsenal, seized control, and took several hostages. Panic rippled through the town. Telegraph wires carried the news in all directions. There's a slave revolt starting. But then reality hit. The local enslaved population didn't rise up en masse. The plan relied on momentum that never came. Brown's men were surrounded. A militia arrived, then US Marines led by, get this, Colonel Robert E. Lee. Yes, that Robert E. Lee. The future Confederate general, at this point, still wearing Union blue. The standoff ended in gunfire. Brown was captured. Most of his men were killed. He was put on trial, found guilty, and sentenced to hang. He had failed, completely. Except he hadn't. While Brown sat in a Virginia jail cell, he wrote letters, gave interviews, spoke like a prophet, and across the North, people listened. Loudly. Historians still argue whether John Brown was a martyr, a lunatic, or something in between, but no one doubts his impact. His raid failed militarily, but it exploded culturally. The North now had a flesh and blood symbol, someone who had put his life on the line for abolition, not just argued, not just voted, but acted. Southern reaction? Utter panic. Brown was the nightmare made real. A Northern abolitionist had led an armed assault on Virginia soil, and it wasn't just Brown. They assumed he had help, that Republican politicians knew, that wealthy abolitionists funded him, that this was just the first spark in a larger fire. Whether those suspicions were true didn't matter. What mattered was how they felt, and they felt like war. In South Carolina and Georgia, militias began drilling more seriously. Governors ordered more weapons. Citizens were told to prepare for further aggressions. The word invasion started appearing in headlines. If this was the new normal, the South wanted to be ready. In the North, things were more complicated. Many moderate politicians condemned Brown. Newspapers called him reckless. But privately, people were shaken, inspired. Even those who opposed violence found themselves admiring his bravery. Ralph Waldo Emerson called him a new saint. Walt Whitman wrote poetry about him. Churches held vigils. Bells tolled across New England on the day of his execution. It felt like something sacred had passed, like a line had been crossed and couldn't be uncrossed. Brown's final words didn't help calm anything. He said, "I am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away, but with blood." Chilling, poetic, and as it turned out, tragically prophetic. Here's a smaller, strange twist. After the raid, Southern states began purging their towns of anyone who seemed too northern. Teachers, missionaries, even shopkeepers were accused of Brownist sympathies. Some were threatened, some fled. The paranoia turned surgical. Meanwhile, in Washington, the center couldn't hold. Politicians tried to distance themselves from Brown, from the violence, from the moral quagmire. But the nation wasn't buying it. Every quiet voter, every dinner table debater, every fence-sitter was being pushed gently, steadily, off the fence. Because Brown's raid made slavery feel unsolvable. If compromise had worked, he wouldn't have had to pick up a rifle. If the system was stable, he wouldn't have died on a gallows. His action made inaction look cowardly or complicit. The South took one lesson from Harper's Ferry. The North was coming for them, not with ballots, but with blood. The North took another. Change wouldn't come gently, and maybe it never had. By the time Brown's body swung beneath that grey December sky, the country had already begun to split, not geographically but emotionally. The maps would catch up soon. By now, the country was a powder keg, and here came Abraham Lincoln, with a lit candle, tall, lanky, full of awkward jokes, and somehow both soft-spoken and razor-sharp. He didn't look like the kind of guy who'd tear a nation in half. But to many Southerners, that's exactly what he represented. Lincoln had been around for a while, state legislator, lawyer, one-time congressman, but it wasn't until the 1858 debates with Stephen Douglas that he vaulted into national attention. These debates were supposed to be about a Senate seat in Illinois. What they turned into was a full-on philosophical wrestling match over the soul of America. Douglas was all about popular sovereignty. Let the people in each territory decide whether to allow slavery. Lincoln, he didn't call for immediate abolition, but he did say this: "A house divided against itself cannot stand," and the South heard that loud and clear. That line, borrowed from the Bible, hit like a thunderclap. Lincoln wasn't saying the nation could balance slavery and freedom forever. He was saying it couldn't, it wouldn't. It would become one or the other. And that idea, that terrified Southern elites more than any army. Lincoln didn't win the Senate race in 1858, but he won hearts and headlines. By 1860, he was the Republican nominee for president. And that's when the real panic began. To understand the 1860 election, imagine a four-way custody battle during a tornado. The country wasn't just divided between North and South. It was fragmented, confused, and limping toward a decision that would rip the bandage clean off. The Democrats couldn't hold it together. The party split. Literally. Northern Democrats backed Stephen Douglas. Southern Democrats went with John C. Breckinridge, who promised to protect slavery in all territories. The third guy, John Bell, tried to run on a let's not fight platform, which mostly got him polite applause and puzzled stares. And then there was Lincoln. No slavery expansion, but no abolition. Yet, moderate, but firm, calm, but uncompromising. Here's a quirky fact. Lincoln's name didn't even appear on the ballot in 10 southern states. That's how deep the divide had gotten. It wasn't just a disagreement, it was like a different country. And yet, Lincoln won. Not by a landslide, but by a clear margin in the Electoral College. The South was stunned, and then it started screaming. To them, this wasn't just a Republican president, it was a signal, a man elected entirely by Northern votes. A president with zero Southern support. The South had been outvoted, outnumbered, and in their minds, outmatched. Historians still argue whether the South overreacted or simply saw the writing on the wall. But within weeks of Lincoln's election, South Carolina called a convention. The question: secession. Lincoln hadn't even taken office yet. He was still in Springfield getting fitted for suits and dodging assassination threats. But his victory was enough. The South didn't trust him, didn't believe him, didn't care that he promised not to interfere with slavery where it already existed. Because they understood something unspoken. Lincoln might not touch slavery today, but he wouldn't let it grow, and if it couldn't grow, it would die. Here's where it gets weird. Lincoln was probably one of the most cautious, legally minded politicians of his era. He bent over backward in speeches to avoid sounding radical. But ideas are slippery things, and Lincoln's core idea that slavery must be placed on the course of ultimate extinction was enough to launch a rebellion. Southern newspapers went full panic mode. The abolitionists have triumphed. Our honor is at stake. Prepare for separation. It was the political version of barricading the windows and loading the musket. And in this chaos, Lincoln stayed quiet, purposefully. He wanted to project calm, reason, stability. But to the South, his silence spoke volumes. Quirky anecdote. When told about threats of secession, Lincoln reportedly said, "They won't. They'll come to their senses." Classic case of underestimating just how deep the wound had got. By December 1860, before Lincoln could even unpack his desk, South Carolina voted to secede from the Union, one state down. More to come. The dominoes were tipping. The election of Lincoln wasn't the start of the divide. It was the confirmation, the moment when the South looked at the future and saw nothing but chains, metaphorical ones of course. Chains of federal power, of isolation, of cultural irrelevance. And for many, the only way to stay free was to leave. The Union wasn't broken yet, but the cracks had turned into canyons. By the end of 1860, the South wasn't just seething, it was scheming. South Carolina had already packed its bags and stormed out of the Union, like someone flipping over a table at Thanksgiving. And now, the rest of the Deep South stood around that metaphorical table, seriously considering whether they should follow. The idea that the South could leave and form its own country wasn't new. Secession had been a murmured fantasy for decades, but now it was becoming an action plan. Meetings were held, delegates were summoned, fire eaters, those political pyromaniacs who openly preached disunion, had gone from fringe voices to headliners. And what was their plan? A new nation, one with slavery enshrined in its founding documents. One where cotton ruled without judgment. One free of Yankee meddling. But there was a wrinkle, a very British, tea-sipping wrinkle. You see, Southern leaders weren't just thinking about separating, they were banking on being welcomed with open arms by Europe, especially Britain, because in the minds of the South's elite, one thing made them irresistible: cotton. They called it King Cotton for a reason. The South produced around 75% of the world's cotton at that point, and Britain's textile mills were practically addicted to it. Southern politicians confidently believed that if they left the Union and formed their own country, Britain and maybe France too, would immediately recognize them, trade with them, and maybe even lend a few warships. The idea was simple: Europe needs cotton. We control cotton. Therefore, Europe needs us. It was like trying to get a date by bragging about your monopoly on oxygen. Historians still argue whether this was savvy strategy or delusional arrogance. Because yes, Britain relied heavily on Southern cotton, but they also hated slavery. Public opinion in London was staunchly abolitionist, and while British elites enjoyed their high thread count shirts, they didn't necessarily want to endorse a slave republic to keep them wrinkle-free. Still, the South clung to this hope. They believed that cotton would be their passport, their currency, their diplomatic weapon. That if push came to shove, London would rather side with the Confederacy than risk a textile shortage and the wrath of every barefoot child in Manchester. There's a quirky twist here. Some Southern planters actually overplanted cotton in 1860 in anticipation of their grand diplomatic debut. They assumed the cotton market would spike and European demand would create leverage. What they didn't account for was that Europe, seeing tensions rise, had quietly stockpiled surplus cotton in advance, meaning the South's big leverage. Not quite as livery, as hope. Meanwhile, the newly forming Confederate States of America, the CSA, started assembling like a DIY government kit. They drafted a constitution, mostly copied from the UN, but with slavery made ironclad, chose their provisional capital in Montgomery, Alabama, and appointed Jefferson Davis as their president. Davis was a former US Senator and Secretary of War, educated, experienced, and tired. He wasn't as charismatic as Lincoln, nor as towering a symbol, but he was a man the South trusted to keep the engine running while the ship turned course. And what was Lincoln doing during all this? Mostly waiting. He hadn't taken office yet. James Buchanan was still technically president and doing a phenomenal impression of a folding chair. Buchanan believed secession was illegal, but also believed he had no authority to stop it. It was the diplomatic equivalent of shrugging through an earthquake. So the South moved fast. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas. By February 1861, 7 states had seceded. More would follow. The speed of it was staggering. What had once been theoretical was now reality. State by state, the Union was being peeled like an orange, and the cotton diplomacy fantasy, still strong. Southern newspapers predicted that within months, Britain would intervene, France would follow, the North would be forced to the table, maybe even recognize the Confederacy, all thanks to cotton. But there was something else hiding in that dream, a deep, unspoken truth. The South needed to believe in cotton diplomacy because it had very few other cards to play. It had no naval power. Its railroads were patchy. Its industrial base was laughable compared to the North's. Its population was smaller, and its entire economic system was built on unpaid labor that most of the civilized world now opposed. Cotton was the crutch, the bluff, the Hail Mary, and when that cotton didn't yield the instant international support they'd hoped for, well, things were going to get complicated. But not just yet. Right now, in early 1861, the South was full of confidence. Toasts were made, flags were raised, parades were held. They believed they'd built a better, purer version of America, one that honored states' rights, preserved Southern honor, and of course protected slavery. And they believed that if Lincoln so much as twitched wrong, they'd be ready. They weren't bluffing, and the next time the North tested them, they'd fire the first shot. By the spring of 1861, the Union was less of a union and more of a very tense group chat, where half the members had rage quit. Lincoln had finally taken office in March, walking into a White House that felt more like a pressure cooker with broken handles. 7 southern states had already seceded, declared themselves a brand new country, and politely informed Washington that any further interference might result in cannon fire. Lincoln, famously cool under pressure, kept his cards close. His inaugural address tried to sound calm and reasonable, but the message underneath was firm. I don't want war, but I will not let this union break apart. No threats, no yelling, just a long, steady stare that said, try me. The South was watching. So was the North, and so were a handful of federal forts still sitting awkwardly inside Confederate territory. The most famous of these, Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter was a small island, fort, off the coast of Charleston, South Carolina. It was barely armed, barely supplied, and surrounded by increasingly cranky Confederate troops, who saw it as a national embarrassment. You couldn't claim to be a new independent country while a US flag still waved defiantly over one of your own harbors. But Lincoln wasn't about to surrender federal property. Doing that would mean recognizing the Confederacy as legit, and that was not going to happen. So Lincoln pulled a classic move. He announced he would resupply the fort, not reinforce it, not attack anyone, just send in food and necessities. Very reasonable, very chill. The South saw it differently. Jefferson Davis and his cabinet decided this was their line in the sand. If they allowed the resupply, they'd look weak. If they fired the first shot, they could frame it as defending their new sovereignty. Guess which option they picked? At 4:30 a.m. on April 12, 1861, Confederate artillery opened fire on Fort Sumter. The bombardment lasted 34 hours. No one died in the actual fighting, but symbolically, it was a gunshot through the heart of national unity. The North was stunned. Lincoln, relieved that the South had officially fired first, now had public support for action. He called for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion. People in northern cities lined up at recruiting stations with fire in their eyes and visions of a short, glorious campaign. And the South. The Upper South, which had hesitated to secede, now had its answer. Virginia seceded next, then Arkansas, then North Carolina, and Tennessee. Suddenly, the Confederacy wasn't just 7 states, it was 11, stretching from Texas to Virginia, with their own capital in Richmond and an army assembling at frightening speed. Historians still debate whether the Confederates believed war would be long and brutal, or short and victorious. Most thought it would be over quickly. A single decisive battle, maybe 2. Cotton would do the rest. Europe would step in. The North would fold. The North? Same delusion. They expected to march into Richmond by summer. One good thrashing and the rebellion collapses, they thought. But this wasn't just a fight over forts or flags anymore. It had become something more primal. The South was fighting for independence and to preserve the system that had made its elite rich. The North was fighting to save the Union and for many to stop the spread of slavery. And while Lincoln insisted early on that the war was about unity, not emancipation, the truth was already changing. You can't crack open the country without the real issue spilling out. Slavery wasn't just in the background anymore, it was on the battlefield, carried by every Confederate soldier, echoing in every Northern speech, filling the air like cannon smoke. Here's a strange little tidbit. Some wealthy Southern planters threw parties the night Fort Sumter fell. Champagne was poured, speeches were made. It was like celebrating a wedding, except the bride was war, and she'd packed a scythe instead of flowers. Meanwhile, in Washington, Lincoln moved fast. He called Congress into session, blockaded southern ports, began reorganizing the military. The wheels of war started turning, creaky but determined, and as they turned, the industrial machine of the North roared to life. Factories that had once made shoes and spoons switched to rifles and uniforms. Railroads were rerouted to move troops. Telegraph wires buzzed with orders. The North, chaotic and divided though it was, still had something the South didn't. Scale. But the South had something too. Determination, familiar ground, skilled generals, and the kind of rage that turns into resilience. They weren't fighting to conquer. They were fighting not to be conquered. So the lines were drawn, the North fueled by factories, railroads, and a growing sense of moral urgency. The South driven by tradition, defiance, and the belief that cotton could still command the world. The dream of compromise was dead. The backroom deals, the polite debates, the fragile band-aids of the past, they had all burned away at Fort Sumter. What came next wouldn't be fast, or clean, or noble. It would be war. Secession had become reality. The cannons at Fort Sumter had thundered the opening notes, and now both North and South were scrambling to figure out what the war was actually going to look like. And here's where things got almost comical, because neither side had any real plan. The South assumed the North would give up after 1 or 2 battles. The North assumed the South couldn't possibly put up a serious fight. Both were wrong. Spectacularly. What neither side quite grasped was that this war wouldn't just be fought with rifles, it would be fought with resources. With railroads, factories, telegraph lines, food supplies, coal, iron, and yes, cotton. Especially cotton. Let's break this down. The Southern economy was almost entirely based on agriculture, and within that, mostly on cotton. Cotton made up about 60% of all US exports before the war. It was grown on massive plantations using enslaved labor and shipped out through southern ports like Charleston, Savannah, and New Orleans. The money flowed in, and the system rolled on, until the blockade started. Lincoln's naval blockade was no joke. Known as the Anaconda Plan, it aimed to strangle the South's economy by closing off access to international markets. Suddenly, that precious cotton couldn't leave, and with it, the dream of cotton diplomacy began to deflate like a leaky balloon. The North, meanwhile, had a little bit of everything. It produced 90% of the nation's firearms. It had 20,000 miles of railroad to the South's 9,000. It manufactured more boots, bullets, and biscuits than the Confederacy could ever dream of. The North had more people, more money, and more ships. It was like trying to fight a steam engine with a wooden cart, and a lot of attitude. Still, the South had one very sharp advantage: morale. They were fighting on their own turf, for what they saw as their survival. Their crops might not win the war, but their cause, that ran deep. They knew the land, the people, and the backroads. And many of their officers were trained at West Point, top-tier military minds, who'd studied under the same flag they were now trying to tear down. Here's a quirky fact: both sides named battles differently. The North named battles after geographic features, rivers, hills. The South used the names of towns. That's why the same battle might be called Bull Run in the North and Manassas in the South. It's like having two people argue whether it's soda or pop, while they're both bleeding out. And while soldiers clashed and cannons thundered, the economies behind them churned like never before. In the South, cotton sat unsold in warehouses. Planters gritted their teeth, refusing to grow food crops, insisting that cotton would somehow still win the war. Many believed Britain would have no choice but to intervene. Meanwhile, food shortages began. Inflation skyrocketed. Confederate money became toilet paper with prettier printing. In the North, war became industry. New factories opened. Women joined the workforce in massive numbers, sewing uniforms, rolling cartridges, managing supply lines. The Union was becoming something new, a wartime economy on overdrive. Railroads played a starring role. The Union moved troops faster than ever before in human history. Soldiers who might have marched for days in earlier wars were now crossing states in hours. Wounded men could be transported to hospitals. Supplies could reach the front in time. The South, with its tangled and broken rail system, couldn't keep up. And yet, despite all this imbalance, the South fought on. Passion counts for something. So does leadership. And in these early years, Confederate generals like Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson seemed to work miracles. Battles were bloody, and victories were costly. But the South held its ground longer than anyone expected. And here's the deeper irony: the North, while technologically superior, was still unsure about its purpose. Was it really just about preserving the Union, or was something bigger at stake? Because every time Union soldiers walked through a Southern plantation, saw the auction blocks, the chains, the scars, something changed. Slowly, painfully, the war's meaning began to shift. But that's for later. Right now, in 1861 and 1862, the war was still about territory, strategy, and supply. A chess match played across rivers, rail lines, and muddy fields. Each side hoping the next move would end it. Each side realizing the board was much, much larger than they thought. And the longer it dragged on, the more obvious it became. Cotton might be king, but iron, coal, and rail, they were the generals now. Washington was breathing through its teeth. The southern states had seceded, Fort Sumter had fallen, and suddenly, President Lincoln was standing in the middle of a wall without a map. The federal government wasn't built for this kind of emergency. There was no War Department ready to deploy tens of thousands of soldiers at a moment's notice. The military was scattered. The budget wasn't ready. And nobody, absolutely nobody, had a step-by-step guide for how to stop your country from unraveling like a bad sweater. So Washington did what governments do best in a panic. It twitched. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers right after Fort Sumter, thinking it might be enough for a quick rebellion-quashing operation. He got way more than that. Across northern cities, men flooded recruitment offices, some bringing their own rifles and matching uniforms their moms had stitched in patriotic frenzy. In New York, whole regiments paraded through the streets like it was the 4th of July. Because, in their heads, the war would be short, romantic, heroic, a quick trip to Dixie then home by harvest. Spoiler, nope. In the meantime, Washington had to reckon with something surreal. A bunch of federal properties, forts, arsenals, custom houses had quietly been taken over by the Confederacy. Entire chunks of the US Army had switched sides. Even former cabinet members and ambassadors had joined the rebellion. It was like hosting a family reunion and realizing half the cousins were now actively building a rival family across the street. The federal government looked weak. Foreign nations watched with morbid curiosity. And Lincoln? He moved faster than anyone expected. He expanded the army, authorized spending, suspended habeas corpus in some areas, a legal term that basically means you can't just arrest people without cause, which Lincoln decided in some cases, yes, you actually could. Historians still debate whether Lincoln was right to do it. Civil liberties took a hit in those early years, especially for suspected Confederate sympathizers. But Lincoln's argument was blunt. You can't preserve the Constitution if the country it governs disappears. While Washington scrambled to tighten its grip, Southern cities were doing the opposite, throwing parties, building militias, printing their own money. In Montgomery and then Richmond, Confederate leaders drafted laws, held strategy meetings, and looked for support from Europe, praying that King Cotton would open diplomatic doors. Meanwhile, the US Capitol looked vulnerable. Washington, D.C., sat between Virginia and Maryland, two slave states. If Maryland joined the Confederacy, the capital would be completely surrounded. So Lincoln made sure Maryland didn't. Troops were stationed, railroad lines were seized, pro-secession newspapers were shut down, with the subtlety of a boot on a typewriter, and all the while soldiers kept arriving, from Iowa, from Indiana, from Maine. Young, nervous, sunburnt, clutching rifles and letters from home, they built camps on Capitol Hill, drilled in the shadow of the Washington Monument. One of the strangest sights of 1861 was the National Mall, now known for joggers and museums, crammed with tents and campfires. The smell, sweat, bacon, and wet wool. And it wasn't just men showing up. Women came too. Not to fight, not yet, but to sew uniforms, tend to the sick, cook for regiments, and organize aid societies. It wasn't a military-industrial complex yet, but the bones of one were forming. Here's a quirky detail. The Treasury started printing what would become known as greenbacks, paper money, not backed by gold, but by trust in the federal government. In other words, money that only worked if the Union survived. It was financial optimism printed in green ink. Still, with all this build-up, Washington was on edge. Confederate troops were camped just across the river in Virginia. Spies moved through the city in plain sight. Sabotage rumors swirled. At one point, Union soldiers discovered a cannon trained on the White House from a nearby rooftop. It turned out to be a false alarm, but still, mood killer. The federal government, used to decades of slow legislation and gentlemanly debate, had to shift gears. It passed laws faster, recruited faster, thought faster, and it began to learn what modern war actually required. Centralization, coordination, and the ability to adapt in real time. But not everyone in the North supported the war. A growing group of dissenters, nicknamed Copperheads, began to argue that Lincoln was overstepping, that the South had a right to secede, and that peace should be negotiated. These voices weren't yet strong, but they were growing louder, especially as the death toll climbed. So Washington braced. It dug in, it learned to walk in uniform, and while Confederate troops made speeches about honor and independence, the Union government quietly transformed into a wartime machine. Lincoln, once mocked for his gangly awkwardness, proved to be something new, steady, ruthless when necessary, and able to absorb crisis like a thunderstorm soaks a field. By the end of 1861, the government was no longer twitching, it was preparing. Fort Sumter had cracked the dam, but now the flood was here, and the war wasn't going to politely stay in forts or forests. It would soon chew through cities, farms, families, and entire ideologies, and its first roaring lesson came in the form of the Battle of Bull Run, or, as the Confederacy called it, the Battle of Manassas. Yes, same battle, two names. Get used to that. This was the first major clash of the Civil War, fought in July 1861, just a few months after the South seceded. The North was riding high on adrenaline, fueled by patriotic songs, fresh uniforms, and the totally false belief that one good push would collapse the whole rebellion, like a card table in a hurricane. So Lincoln sent the Union Army, still green, still figuring out how to march in a straight line, southward from Washington toward a strategic railroad junction near Manassas, Virginia. The idea: catch the Confederates off guard, win quickly, and head back to D.C. in time for dinner. Some wealthy citizens even packed picnic baskets and followed along, hoping to watch the battle from a safe hill like it was a Sunday opera. Big mistake. What followed was chaos. Gunfire in every direction. Troops firing on their own side in the smoke. Officers barking contradictory orders. Confederate reinforcements arrived by train, making Bull Run one of the first battles in history where railroads directly influenced the outcome. And in the thick of it all stood Confederate General Thomas Jackson, calmly holding his line under heavy fire. One Southern officer reportedly shouted, "There stands Jackson like a stone wall." Whether it was admiration or annoyance is still debated, but the name stuck. From then on he was Stonewall Jackson, part myth, part man. And the Union, they broke. They didn't just retreat, they ran. Horses, wagons, artillery, abandoned. Troops fled back toward Washington in full panic mode, tripping over the very civilians who'd shown up to watch the show. Bull Run was a disaster for the North, but more importantly, it was a reality check. This wasn't going to be a weekend war, it wasn't going to be polite, and the Confederacy, it wasn't bluffing. Historians still argue whether the South missed its best chance at an early victory right then. The Confederate Army was too disorganized to follow up. They didn't march on Washington, they let the moment pass. But the psychological blow had landed. The North was stunned. Lincoln went pale, and the country, both sides of it, suddenly realized this was going to be a long, bloody road. Back in Washington, the mood shifted instantly. Gone were the parades, gone were the speeches about short campaigns. Now, it was time for long-term strategy, training, and an honest look at just how serious this war was going to be. Lincoln immediately appointed General George B. McClellan to rebuild the army. McClellan was young, ambitious, and had a reputation for brilliance, which he enthusiastically wrote about in his own letter. A self-proclaimed genius, McClellan spent months drilling and organizing the Union Army of the Potomac into a pristine fighting force. But when it came time to use it, let's just say his sword hand was permanently stuck in the hesitate position. Meanwhile, the Confederacy took the win at Bull Run and puffed its chest. Southern newspapers declared it proof of divine favor. Churches rang bells. Even the most cautious Southerners began to believe, we can win this. But winning what? Exactly. That's where things got murky. The North was fighting to preserve the Union, the South for independence. But the longer the war dragged on, the more both sides realized they were fighting for something deeper. Two different visions of America. For the South, it was about sovereignty, honor, and the preservation of a way of life built openly and unapologetically on slavery. For the North, the cause began as preservation, but the cracks were forming, and into those cracks would soon pour a more explosive question. Should this war also end slavery? Not yet. Not officially. But in the meantime, the Union built up its war machine. More troops, more weapons, more factories turned into bullet mills, and one very important move, the rail network. Here's a detail people often miss. After Bull Run, the Union started militarizing the railroads. Trains became lifelines, not just for moving troops, but for transporting supplies, evacuating wounded, and maintaining control. The government even formed the U.S. Military Railroad, a literal wartime train company with its own engineers, cars, and strategy. Confederate lines, by contrast, were fragmented. Different gauges, limited routes, poor upkeep. In some cases, the South tore up tracks and reused the iron to make cannonballs. Resourceful? Yes. Efficient? Not remotely. By early 1862, Lincoln was changing tactics. The plan: squeeze the Confederacy from all sides, cut them off from international trade, push along the Mississippi, blockade their ports, and hope they ran out of will or supplies before the North ran out of patience. But the war was already seeping into homes, towns, and newspapers. Civilians were starting to feel it. Prices rose, letters arrived with black edges, newspapers printed casualty lists longer than sermons, and still more men volunteered. More towns held send-offs, because the war, for all its horror, had become something else too, personal. This wasn't just about cotton or tariffs anymore. It was about identity, pride, and the fear of losing everything. And as each side dug in, A new kind of certainty began to harden. The other side wasn't just wrong, it was dangerous. As the war dragged on, the logic of King Cotton started to unravel fast. The Confederacy had strutted into secession believing that cotton was their trump card. Cotton would force Britain and France to come crawling with treaties, ships, and bags of gold. After all, how could the mighty British textile industry survive without Southern cotton? Here's the problem. The South forgot that Britain wasn't the only one who could prepare for a crisis. Before the war, British and French mills had been heavily dependent on US cotton. That part was true, but when war seemed inevitable, they did what prudent empires do. They stocked up. Warehouses across Liverpool and Le Havre were stuffed to the rafters with raw cotton, enough to last for months, maybe years. And when that ran low, they turned elsewhere. India, Egypt, even Brazil. Was it lower quality? Yes. Did it keep the looms running? Also yes. Meanwhile, the South, believing its cotton was too valuable to sell cheaply, started hoarding it. Planters burned bales rather than let them be exported through the blockade at low prices. They called it the cotton embargo, and it was a classic case of cutting off your nose to spite your economy. Historians still argue whether the cotton embargo was a brilliant gamble or a catastrophic blunder. Spoiler, it was a blunder. The longer the war dragged on, the more obvious it became. Europe wasn't going to ride in like a cavalry charge. British politicians, despite a few aristocrats who admired the southern gentry, couldn't openly support a rebellion based on slavery. The British public, who had ended slavery in their own empire decades earlier, simply wouldn't have it. There were moments, especially during Union low points, where European intervention seemed possible, but those hopes faded like mist in sunlight. Cotton hadn't been king. It had been a temporarily powerful baron, and now he'd been deposed. While the South waited for a diplomatic miracle, the North pressed its industrial advantage. Factories in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and New York went into overdrive. Railroads stitched together supply chains that fed entire armies. The Union began to standardize everything: uniforms, weapons, rations. The military became a kind of machine, learning painfully how to adapt to mass production. And the soldiers, they were learning too. Gone were the days of naive volunteers with shiny boots and poems in their pockets. The men marching now had seen things: bloody fields, burned homes, empty sleeves, and graves dug in frozen ground. This war wasn't about grand strategy anymore. It was about attrition. Food became a weapon. The Union blockade was working. Southern ports were silent. Cotton rotted. Salt, sugar, coffee gone or absurdly expensive. Confederate soldiers lived on cornbread and dried peas. Civilians boiled shoe leather for soup. Mothers watched their children wither from hunger, not bullets. Here's a quirky but brutal detail. The South ran so short on cloth that they started repurposing anything: curtains, carpets, even funeral shrouds, to make uniforms. Some soldiers marched barefoot, some had no uniforms at all, just ragged clothes, a musket, and the memory of better days. Meanwhile, the northern economy actually grew during the war. Yes, there were inflation and shortages, but also innovation, contracts, and industrial expansion. War was hell, but also lucrative, especially if you owned a steel mill. And through it all, the railroads did what the Confederacy could only dream of. Union trains carried troops from coast to coast, supplies from depot to depot. Even the telegraph lines that ran beside the tracks carried war orders faster than ever before. For the first time in history, a commander in Washington could send orders to a general on the front that same day. The South had no such luxury. Messages were handwritten, passed on horseback, or intercepted by Union spies. Supplies were inconsistent. Entire Confederate armies went hungry not because the South couldn't grow food, but because it couldn't move. And the psychological toll, devastating. Southern soldiers fought harder knowing their families back home were suffering. But morale started to crack. Desertion rose. Letters from home were filled with worry, not pride. Some Confederate newspapers quietly suggested peace negotiation. Not publicly, though. That would have been treason. In the North, the narrative was shifting. The war had started as a mission to preserve the Union. Now, more and more people were calling it something else. A moral reckoning. a crusade, a chance to end slavery once and for all. And in that space between collapsing economies and shifting ideologies, the real war, the one for the soul of the country, began to take shape. If you wanted to know who had the upper hand in this war, you didn't need a battle map, you just needed to ride the trains. The Union's railway system wasn't just longer than the Confederacy's, it was smarter, faster, and part of a grander vision. Where the South had railroads as a convenience, the North had them as a spine. This wasn't a war of cavalry charges and field drums anymore. It was a war of logistics, of how many boots you could deliver by Tuesday, how many crates of hardtack made it to the front, how many rifles reached the depot before your enemy caught their breath. And the Union had turned its railroads into an artery of war. By 1863, the US military railroad system was humming. The government didn't just use existing lines, they built new ones. Tracks were laid specifically to supply armies on the move. Railroad repair crews became as important as artillery units. Union generals could coordinate offensives across entire states with timetables and telegraphs. It was military choreography, and the trains kept time. The South, not so much. Southern railroads were a patchwork mess. Many used different gauges, meaning the rails were different widths, so cars couldn't transfer from one system to another. Supplies had to be unloaded and reloaded, often by hand. Rail lines ended randomly, or worse, led to nowhere once key bridges or tracks were destroyed. And repairs, nearly impossible when you didn't have the iron, the labor, or the spare locomotives. Even when supplies did make it through, the South lacked a central distribution system. Corn might rot in Georgia, while troops starved in Virginia. A Confederate soldier once wrote that he could march better on rumors than rations. And it wasn't just food. Shoes, coats, medicine, even bullets. Southern soldiers frequently went into battle underfed, underdressed, and under-equipped. There are diary entries of men tying rags around their feet, fighting in torn coats, reusing spent bullets. By contrast, Union supply trains arrived with military precision, loaded down with fresh uniforms, mail, coffee, and newspapers. Here's a quirky detail. The North actually created mobile bakeries, literal bread-baking wagons, that followed the army to provide hot loaves. The Confederacy was rationing cornmeal by the ounce, while the Union served warm carbs to tired troops. And the difference wasn't just practical, it was psychological. Union soldiers wrote letters describing how the train lines made them feel powerful, supported, connected. They could ride for days and arrive at a battlefield ready to fight. They knew reinforcements weren't just a hope, they were coming. You could hear them arrive. For Confederate troops, that sound meant doom. When General Sherman launched his famous campaign into Georgia, it was like unleashing a steel serpent. He moved 60,000 men with speed and coordination that stunned the South. His supply lines were so efficient that his armies moved like cities, complete with field hospitals, mobile telegraphs, and coordinated resupply schedules. The South tried to counter sabotage missions, guerrilla attacks, rail lines torn up and twisted into Sherman's neckties, metal rails heated and bent around trees to make them unusable. But it wasn't enough. Every time they tore up a track, Union engineers laid it back down. And as the Union trains rolled forward, Confederate spirits sagged. They watched their world being outmaneuvered, not just on the battlefield, but in the supply chain. It became clear that the North wasn't just winning, it was evolving. The South couldn't match that. It didn't have the infrastructure, it didn't have the manpower, and by 1864 it didn't have the time. Meanwhile, civilians felt the squeeze. In northern cities, trains brought meat, newspapers, and mail. In southern towns, they brought fear, if they ran at all. Telegraph wires were silent, trains were empty or didn't come at all. Whole counties slipped into isolation, not just physically, but emotionally. The war began to feel like an endless storm, and the trains were thunder in the distance. Back in Washington, Lincoln and his generals could see it clearly. Every foot of track the Union held was a noose tightening around the Confederacy. Every station captured was a knife to the Southern heart. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. Historians still debate whether logistics won the war or just shortened it. But one thing's certain, You don't win a war on ideals alone. You win it with wheels, schedules, crates, beams, bullets, and trains. Lots and lots of trains. While America was tearing itself apart, the rest of the world watched from the sidelines, curious, skeptical, and quietly wondering who might come out on top. The Civil War wasn't just a domestic crisis. It was a diplomatic tug-of-war, and both sides had their eyes firmly fixed on Europe, especially Britain and France. At first, the Confederacy was smug. They believed that their cotton was not just valuable, it was irreplaceable. The textile mills of Manchester, England, and the looms of Lyon, France ran on southern cotton. Surely, the logic went, those countries wouldn't let their industries collapse just to stay neutral in someone else's civil squabble. So Confederate leaders sent envoys. They printed fancy stationery that said Confederate States of America. They put on their best waistcoats and tried to walk like diplomats instead of rebels. They lobbied Parliament, whined French aristocrats, spoke of honor, independence, shared values, and liberty, which was awkward considering slavery was baked into their entire cause. Here's the awkward truth. European elites did sympathize, in some ways. Britain's upper crust admired the southern gentry. French leaders, under Napoleon III, were interested in weakening the United States. And yes, cotton was a big deal. When the Union blockade choked off southern exports, thousands of British mill workers went out of work. It caused what became known as the Lancashire Cotton Famine. But something happened that the Confederacy didn't count on: the British public. You see, Britain had abolished slavery decades earlier, and the idea of recognizing a government built on human bondage, it was toxic. Working-class Brits, even those suffering unemployment, held rallies against the Confederacy. Letters to editors poured in. Clergymen preached against any support for a slave-holding nation. One quirky bit: when Confederate agents sent letters arguing their case to British newspapers, they often avoided mentioning slavery entirely. They'd talk about tariffs, northern aggression, states' rights. Sound familiar? But British readers weren't fooled. The stench of slavery was too strong, and no amount of perfume, political or otherwise, could mask it. So Britain held back. So did France. Both countries issued declarations of neutrality. They recognized the Confederacy as belligerents, not a sovereign nation. That meant they could engage in limited trade, but there would be no alliances, no recognition, no warships flying Confederate flags. For the South, this was devastating. Their entire strategy had been built on foreign support. Cotton diplomacy had become cotton delusion, and the clock was ticking. The North, on the other hand, understood the game and played it cautiously. Lincoln and Secretary of State William Seward were obsessed with keeping Europe out of the war. They knew that if Britain or France officially supported the South, it could be catastrophic. So Lincoln walked a tightrope. That's one reason the Emancipation Proclamation came when it did in 1863, not sooner. Lincoln waited until the Union had a battlefield victory, Antietam, barely, then announced that all slaves in rebel states would be free. It didn't technically end slavery everywhere, but it changed the war's moral landscape. Suddenly, the Union wasn't just fighting to save itself, it was fighting slavery. And Europe noticed. British politicians who had once waffled now had a clearer picture. Support the South, and you're supporting slavery. Stay neutral, and you're avoiding a PR disaster. Even those suffering from the cotton shortage grudgingly respected the Union's new position. And the Confederacy, it raged. Southern newspapers called the Emancipation Proclamation an act of desperation. Jefferson Davis said it proved Lincoln was trying to incite slave revolts, and the South's last thread of diplomatic hope snapped. Historians still argue, if the South had won more early battles, could Britain or France have recognized them? Possibly, but they didn't, and once the moral tide turned, it was over. Even Confederate naval hopes took a hit. They had hired British shipbuilders to create powerful commerce raiders like the CSS Alabama, which wreaked havoc on Union merchant ships. But eventually, the British cracked down. Under diplomatic pressure, they stopped building ships for the South. It was a slow bleed, but a fatal one. Meanwhile, Union diplomats worked overtime in Europe, reminding everyone that the Confederacy was trying to dissolve a democracy, that the US had abolished the international slave trade decades ago, that Lincoln was leading a moral crusade, and the narrative stuck. One odd little twist: some European volunteers actually came and fought in the Union Army. Irish, German, Polish, even Italian soldiers saw the war as a fight for liberty, a kind of ideological pilgrimage. One Hungarian officer who had fought with revolutionary forces in Europe wrote, "This is the last battlefield of freedom in the world." In short, the South's great diplomatic strategy, use cotton to win friends, had backfired. They had misunderstood the world's shifting values. Yes, economics mattered, but so did optics, and fighting a war to preserve slavery in the 1860s. That looked bad in London, it looked worse in Paris, and it smelled like death in the pages of European newspapers. So Europe waited, and watched, and decided not to help. By 1863, the war was no longer pretending to be just about secession or preserving the Union. The elephant in the room, slavery, had walked center stage, climbed onto the podium, and was now shouting into a megaphone. This didn't happen all at once. In the early years, Lincoln had been cautious. He famously said, "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it." The priority was survival, not revolution. But war has a way of clarifying things. The deeper Union soldiers pushed into Southern territory, the more obvious it became. This war could not be separated from slavery. Everywhere they marched, they found it. On plantations, in towns, in the terrified eyes of women and children who'd never known freedom. You couldn't unsee it. You couldn't unknow it. And then came the turning point, the Emancipation Proclamation. January 1st, 1863. Lincoln signed an executive order that declared all enslaved people in Confederate-held territory to be forever free. Not in the border states, not in loyal areas, only in places still in rebellion. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't comprehensive, but it was a seismic shift. It redefined the war. The North was no longer just fighting to keep states together. It was now officially fighting to end slavery. A messy, uneven bureaucratic emancipation. Yes, but the message rang out. This war has a moral purpose. Historians still argue about Lincoln's timing. Was it a strategic move to prevent European intervention? Was it meant to rally morale after bloody years of stalemate? Was it sincere, political, or both? The answer, yes. All of it. Lincoln was many things, but he wasn't stupid. He knew what the proclamation would cost, and what it could gain. The reaction, exactly as explosive as you'd expect. In the North, abolitionists wept, prayed, celebrated. Church bells rang, black communities held parades. Freedmen's schools and aid societies formed overnight. It wasn't the end of slavery, but it was the beginning of the end. But not everyone cheered. Many Northern Democrats accused Lincoln of overreach. They argued he had no authority to free slaves in areas he didn't even control. Some feared a wave of newly freed people migrating north, competing for jobs. Others simply didn't believe black Americans deserved freedom. And in the South, fury. Southern leaders denounced the proclamation as illegal, immoral, and designed to incite slave revolts. Confederate newspapers dripped with rage. They claimed it proved the North wasn't interested in peace, that Lincoln was a tyrant, that the war had crossed a line from politics to annihilation. And it had, just not in the way they thought. The proclamation also changed the makeup of the Union Army. For the first time, black men were formally invited to enlist, and they did, by the tens of thousands. Escaped slaves, freedmen from the North, even teenagers too young to shave. They joined up, knowing full well the risks. If captured by the Confederates, they could be executed or re-enslaved. Still, they came. By the war's end, nearly 80,000 black soldiers had served in the Union ranks. Another 20,000 served in the Navy. They fought at Port Hudson, at Fort Wagner, at Petersburg. Their presence wasn't just symbolic, it was strategic. Here's a quirky fact. The 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, one of the first black units, was commanded by a white officer, Robert Gould Shaw. Their attack on Fort Wagner became legendary, and though it failed, Their bravery turned the tide of public opinion. Suddenly, the image of a Union soldier wasn't just a white farmer from Ohio, it was a former slave charging into cannon fire. Confederate reaction? Panic. Outrage. Many Southern commanders refused to treat captured black soldiers as legitimate combatants. Some were executed on the spot. Others were sold back into slavery. The war had gone from dirty to depraved, and the more black soldiers marched under the Union flag, the more the war's moral stakes deepened. What had begun as a fight over secession was now a crusade, whether the North wanted it or not. Even Union generals, some of whom had no strong feelings about slavery at first, began to change. Seeing the reality of bondage, the scars, the chains, the systemic cruelty, it left marks. Diaries from officers show the evolution. They came to preserve a nation. They stayed to destroy an evil. And for Lincoln, the war had become something else entirely. In speeches, he stopped tiptoeing. He called slavery what it was. He prayed for its end. He spoke of justice, of repair, of the country's soul. The war hadn't just escalated, it had matured, hardened, grown into something larger than either side had imagined. And now it had no reverse gear. By 1864, the war had taken on a bitter rhythm. Battles, retreats, victories claimed, territory lost, and somewhere in the middle, the constant thrum of death. But while bullets and bayonets still ruled the front lines, another kind of war was quietly being waged in the background. The war for political survival. Because here's the thing, Lincoln wasn't a wartime monarch. He was an elected president. And 1864, that was an election year. Yes, right in the middle of the bloodiest conflict in American history, the United States paused to ask, so, should we let this guy keep going? It would have been almost laughable if the stakes weren't so high. Lincoln wasn't just fighting to win a war, he was fighting to keep his job. And early that year, it looked bad. The North was exhausted. The casualty lists were obscene. Gettysburg was in the rearview mirror, but the war wasn't ending. General Grant had launched a campaign in Virginia that chewed up men like meat in a grinder. Sherman was slogging through Georgia with brutal slowness, and in places like New York, Cincinnati, and Chicago, people were starting to ask, what's the point? Lincoln's political enemies smelled blood, figuratively and literally. The Democratic Party nominated George B. McClellan, the former Union general Lincoln had fired. McClellan ran on a platform that basically said, let's end this thing, negotiate peace, restore the Union, but without freeing the slaves. It was a powerful message for war-weary voters. Peace, stability, no more telegrams listing the dead, no more taxes to fund rifles and coffins. Just Lincoln knew he was in trouble. His cabinet knew it. In private letters, even Lincoln predicted he would lose. And if he lost, the war might end with the South intact, slavery preserved, everything he'd fought for, gone. But something changed in the fall. First, General Sherman broke through in Georgia. After months of grinding, he captured Atlanta in September 1864. It was a huge military and psychological victory. The Confederacy's back was cracking. Then came the news blitz. Northern newspapers screamed, "Atlanta is ours." Union flags went back up. Recruiting numbers spiked. Lincoln's approval ratings soared. The tide had turned. Lincoln won re-election. Not just narrowly, resoundingly, over 55% of the popular vote, and a crushing majority in the Electoral College. The people had spoken, and they chose to finish what they'd started. It was more than a political win. It was a mandate, a message to the Confederacy. The North wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. But this wasn't the only crucial vote in 1864. Congress had been working on something massive, a constitutional amendment to abolish slavery forever. The Emancipation Proclamation had freed enslaved people in rebel-held territories, but it didn't apply to places like Kentucky or Missouri. It was an executive order, not law. It could be challenged, reversed. So they drafted the 13th Amendment. Lincoln pushed it hard. He met with wavering congressmen. He made promises, applied pressure. Some of his methods were creative. Honest Abe wasn't above a little political grease when the stakes were this high. Finally, in early 1865, the House passed it. Slavery, everywhere, would be abolished. Quirky detail. When the vote passed, the gallery erupted. Lawmakers wept, hugged, some even danced. One reporter called it the moment the nation was reborn. And it wasn't just symbolic. Union troops were now liberators in every sense of the word. Wherever they marched, slavery crumbled, plantations were abandoned, enslaved people ran to the sound of Yankee drums. Some joined the army, others just left, finally free to decide where to walk and who to be. The Confederacy, by contrast, was imploding. Its economy was wrecked, its cities were burning, its soldiers were deserting in droves. And now, they had no hope of negotiating peace that would preserve their peculiar institution. Because the North had spoken through ballots and bullets, the war was about slavery now, and it was going to end, one way or another. By early 1865, the Confederacy wasn't just losing, it was unraveling. The dream of a Southern nation, once paraded through marble halls and toasted in candlelit parlors, was now being stuffed into saddlebags and burned in courtyards. The war that was supposed to last a few months had dragged on for 4 brutal years, and the South was running out of everything: food, men, railroads, morale, hope. Richmond, the Confederate capital, trembled like an egg on the edge of a table. Sherman's march to the sea had carved through Georgia like a hot knife through cotton. Entire towns were leveled, railroads twisted into knots, fields torched. It wasn't just war, it was strategy. Psychological warfare, break the will, leave no doubt. Meanwhile, General Ulysses S. Grant had locked horns with Robert E. Lee in Virginia. It was a slow, grinding campaign. Think trench warfare before trench warfare was trendy. Grant wasn't interested in flashy victories anymore. He was interested in attrition. He knew the North had more men, more supplies, more everything. If he could bleed the Confederate army long enough, they'd have to fold. And slowly, painfully, it worked. Confederate troops were hungry. Literally, some hadn't been paid in months. Their shoes were falling apart. Horses were dying. Letters from home told of empty pantries, Union soldiers nearby, and neighbors who'd already surrendered. Even within the Confederate government, cracks split the surface. There were arguments, loud ones, about whether to arm enslaved people in exchange for freedom. Think about that. A nation founded on slavery, debating whether to free slaves in order to keep existing. It was ideological whiplash. Jefferson Davis, still clinging to the fantasy of independence, gave speeches about perseverance and destiny. But outside the Capitol walls, Confederate newspapers hinted at collapse. Soldiers deserted in record numbers. Whole regiments vanished overnight. Then, in April 1865, it happened. Grant broke through at Petersburg, a key rail hub outside Richmond. The Confederate lines snapped. Lee had no choice. He evacuated the capital. Richmond burned, not entirely by Union hands, but by retreating Confederates trying to deny their enemy the spoils. The city lit up the sky like a signal flare of failure. Union troops entered Richmond soon after. Among them were black soldiers, some former slaves, now marching proudly through streets that had once celebrated their bondage. Southern civilians watched in stunned silence. Lee tried to regroup his remaining forces at Appomattox Courthouse, but it was hopeless. The Union Army was on every road. His men were starving, exhausted, cornered. On April 9, 1865, Robert E. Lee met Ulysses S. Grant in a small, unassuming house. They shook hands. Grant, dressed like a dusty soldier. Lee, immaculate in grey. The surrender was brief, respectful, and historic. Lee asked that his men be allowed to return home, keep their horses, and not be punished. Grant agreed. There were no speeches, no triumphal parades, just quiet relief. This war, was ending. News traveled fast. Bells rang in northern cities. Churches overflowed. Fireworks exploded. After 4 years, 600,000 deaths, and a country held together by sheer willpower, peace had finally started to whisper. But it was fragile, because 5 days later, Abraham Lincoln was shot. At Ford's Theater, during a play by John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer who believed he was striking a blow for the South. Instead, he created a martyr, Lincoln died the next morning. The president who had navigated the country through war, preserved the Union, and launched emancipation, was gone. It was a national gut punch. Quirky, tragic detail. Lincoln's funeral train retraced his 1860 campaign trail in reverse. Town after town turned out to watch his coffin pass. Children lined the tracks. Grown men sobbed in silence. And in that sorrow, something solidified. The North didn't just win the war, they inherited the burden of what came next. Because yes, the Confederacy had fallen, yes, slavery was ending. But the hard part? Rebuilding a country where both sides had tried to kill each other, where 4 million people had just been freed, but had no land, no money, and no guarantee of protection. Reconstruction was coming, and it would be almost as brutal as the war, but that's another story. For now, the fighting had stopped. The trains had halted. The rifles were quiet. The South was ash and surrender, and the Union. It was still standing, scarred, grieving, changed forever, but standing. The guns were silent. The flags, some tattered, some newly raised, hung in the still air of a war-ravaged spring. But if you thought peace arrived with grace and clarity, you'd be wrong, because now came the part where the country had to live with everything it had done. The Civil War had ended, but the war over what it meant had just begun. 4 million people had been freed. 4 million human beings, born into bondage, now legally unchained. But freedom, as it turns out, doesn't come with instructions. No land, no compensation, no safety net, just the vague promise that from now on, they would not be owned. Some stayed near their plantations. Others left with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the memory of where they never wanted to be again. Families reunited. Churches were built. Schools opened in shacks with no roofs. And in all of it, one question loomed. Would freedom really mean equality? The short answer, no, not yet. In the South, the defeat stung like salt in an open wound. The cities were scarred. The fields burned. Their sons were dead or missing, their labor system gone. Many former Confederates returned to find homes reduced to ruins, and an economy that had completely collapsed. And rather than accepting the outcome, many chose a more bitter path. Resentment. Reconstruction began with cautious hope. Federal troops were stationed in the South to maintain order. Black Americans registered to vote for the first time. They won elections. They built lives. And for a brief moment, the dream of a truly multiracial democracy flickered on the horizon. But the backlash was swift. White supremacist groups formed almost immediately. The Ku Klux Klan was born in the ashes of defeat, dressing its hatred in hoods and crosses. Redemption became a Southern political slogan, not about healing, but about reclaiming power from newly freed citizens and their allies. Voter intimidation, lynchings, and new laws, so-called black codes, were all part of the counter-offensive. The North, exhausted, slowly looked away. Reconstruction faltered. Federal support faded, and by the late 1870s the troops were gone. The South returned to local control, meaning the old hierarchies now dressed up as new one. But even in this grim unraveling, seeds had been planted. The 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments remained, written into the Constitution like defiant inscriptions. Slavery abolished, citizenship guaranteed, voting rights theoretically protected. They were bruised, battered, and ignored, but not erased. And beneath the ashes, black communities endured. They built towns, founded colleges, started newspapers, and raised generations who refused to forget. Meanwhile, the North changed too. The war had industrialized it. Faster railroads, larger factories, denser cities. The idea of a centralized, powerful federal government had been cemented. The concept of liberty, once abstract, had been burned into national identity, though often selectively applied. And the presidency? Lincoln had redefined it. After his death, no one ever saw the role the same way again. The man who had walked the tightrope between unity and freedom had become more than just a leader. He'd become a symbol, flawed, complex, sometimes cautious, but in the end, resolute. Quirky final detail. In the years after the war, people would collect Civil War artifacts like souvenirs. mini balls, belt buckles, pieces of uniform, tiny fragments of a time so painful it couldn't be fully spoken aloud, only remembered in objects. And what about those early sparks? Tariffs, trains, cotton? Well, they mattered. Of course they did. Tariffs inflamed the South. Trains connected the North. Cotton built the wealth and the rot. But they were just the tinder. The fire? That was slavery. Always had been. And when the fire finally burned itself out, the country stood blinking in the smoke, changed, broken, not entirely whole, but still standing. That's what the war did. It answered one question: would the United States stay united? But it left another hanging in the air. Would it ever truly be just? So now, here you are. The war is over. The cannons have cooled. The uniforms are folded and fading in dusty trunks. And the questions we started with about tariffs, trains, and cotton feel a bit smaller now, don't they? They were real, yes. They shaped decisions, stirred resentment, helped tear the seams. But they weren't the engine. They were the oil in a machine already built on something far more combustible. Human lives bought and sold as property. The country didn't fall into war by accident. It walked there, step by step, year by year, arguing about state rights, declaring compromises, shifting boundaries, all while sidestepping the truth that eventually demanded attention. And when it came, it didn't whisper. It screamed, "But you've made it." Through decades of tension, through fields of fire, through the long hard lessons carved into railroad tracks and printed in abolitionist papers, through the silence after the last rifle shot, you now know what it took to end the myth of a divided, yet peacefully coexisting America. And you also know, the end wasn't really the end. Rebuilding took generations. Some parts are still under construction, but that's a story for another night. So let your mind drift. Imagine the trains finally resting, the fields turning green again, the cotton bales stacked but no longer soaked in cruelty, the telegraph wires humming only with peace, and somewhere a battered flag, stitched back together, flutters in the morning light. It's over now, the worst of it. So breathe easy, rest deep, and sleep well.